In the several PowerPoints associated with Jesus' ministry in and around the city of Jerusalem, we'll look at different aspects of his ministry and the overall lay of the land. Jerusalem, of course, established by David as the new capital around 1000 BC, and of course stood as that capital, even though invaded several times until the destruction by the Babylonians in 586. Under Cyrus, of course, that we looked at in the stages of the Persian Empire, the restoration, the rebuilding process, which, as you know, took place over an extensive period of time. It was from 538 to 515 before the temple was finished. It was under Nehemiah that the walls would be refurbished and fortified, and that's in the mid-5th century BC. And then slowly through the period, there are extensive building projects that, of course, peaked under the reign of Herod the Great that we looked at in a previous session. So in the Temple Mount area, numerous examples of Jesus' ministry there, from the cleansing of the temple to the description of, as he was speaking of his own life, the destruction of the temple in 3 days, rebuilding it. But the temple was a marvel of the day, and the architectural style started under Herod the Great, was still under construction during the time when Pilate was, of course, the leader in Jerusalem and Caesarea. So Jesus' ministry in Jerusalem, we'll look at kind of phasing through the various locations of his miraculous healings, such as the Pool of Bethesda, excavated extensively in the 20th century, and has continued to have some minor work even into the current 21st century, but is on display there in Jerusalem on the north side of the Temple Mount. On the totally opposite southern end of the city, we had the Pool of Siloam, where Jesus healed the blind man. And so that pool has been finally excavated back in the mid-2000s, 2004, 2005. They actually found the real Pool of Siloam. It was thought to be in a different location in the previous generations, but the excavations on the southern end of the tip of the original Davidic Ophel, we call it, the city of David, from the original conquest of the city by David's men back around 1000 BC. So we have the Pool of Siloam and then other featured places around the city. We'll then look at, of course, the issue of the location of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. So two sites have been, again, suggested, particularly over the last century and a half, as the possible location. But the oldest tradition goes back to the time of the Byzantines under Constantine and his mother Helena. So back in the discussions of early research in the land, in the early Byzantine period with the Constantinian Revolution and the adoption of Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire, the mother of Constantine, Helena, was very much interested in biblical traditions and the sites of various miracles of Jesus. And so hence on those locations, there would be, throughout the Byzantine period, numerous churches that were both functional churches in the way we think of church, but also, and perhaps even primarily, as pilgrimage churches where people could come and worship God and remember events of Jesus' ministry, particularly the miraculous works of healing and cleansing and other types of miracles along the seashore. So the building of churches became this important part of the Byzantine era in the preservation of the history of the biblical text. So along that line then, we have the discussion about the place of the death, burial, and resurrection. The early church decision in the time of Helena was this location we know today as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is located within the walls of Jerusalem, but was actually outside of the walls of Jerusalem during the time of Jesus. The city expanded under Herod Agrippa around 45, 46 BC to the north and incorporated that area, which was, again, thought by the later on, the early Byzantines to be the place of Jesus' crucifixion. So it's located within the Old City today, but outside the Old City during the time of Jesus' ministry. But the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and in the PowerPoints you'll look at the reasons for the support of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as being the place of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. One of the interesting facets to that particular church is that we actually do have first century tombs remaining in one of the back rooms off to the south side of the traditional site of the burial of Jesus. To the north of the Old City walls today, outside of the Damascus Gate, as it's called, is Gordon's Calvary, also known as the Garden Tomb. That is related to a tradition that is late 19th century under a British General Gordon who was staying during his ambassadorship and leadership in the area of Palestine. General Gordon had a vision of the body of Christ laying across Jerusalem and across from where he was staying north of the Damascus Gate. He saw this hill that had a skull shape, and so he thought this then was the place of Golgotha, which of course means skull, and so he associated it as the place over against the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So over time, he and his friends raised money to buy the property around this particular portion of the hill and develop what is known today as the Society of the Garden Tomb. And so that associated. But we'll look at in the PowerPoint those arguments for and against both the Holy Sepulchre and the Garden Tomb. I'll say in advance, before you've actually looked at it, that the Garden Tomb has very little support for it. It is actually part of a complex of tombs that date back to the time of between Jeremiah and Ezra. So again, 6th century BC down to 5th century BC, where there are actually in the whole hill on the north side and the northeast side of the Garden Tomb, there are actually a number of tomb complexes that date back to the last days of the Kingdom of Judah and to the early days of the Restoration. The area where the Garden Tomb exists today and what you see is a result of quarrying that took place during the Byzantine period for the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Again, in the Byzantine period, starting in the 4th century AD. So we'll look at the backdrop of the crucifixion and, of course, the burial and then resurrection were all closely associated. And we'll look at different tomb types as well. The Garden Tomb does not reflect upon tomb typology, we call it, the type of tomb construction that is known in the New Testament era over against what was known in the Old Testament era, particularly in the latter days of the Kingdom of Judah and the restored Judah in the post-exilic period. So we'll look at that constitution. A related, by the way, issue in early church history, and we'll also look at Bethlehem, where a church, and one of the best preserved of the ancient churches, is located, called the Church of the Nativity. Helena's biblical scholars and others who began searching out the locations of events of Jesus' ministry, and of course, including his birth, tracing back local traditions that would go back to Justin Martyr at the end of the 1st century AD, that a particular area of caves was associated by local Christians as being the place of Jesus' birth. And so that a Church of the Nativity was built over the site in the early Byzantine era. Next to it is the Church of St. Catherine, and in front of the church today there is a statue of Jerome. In Jerome's work in translating the Bible into Latin, utilizing the best Greek and Hebrew manuscripts of his day, claims to have done most of his work, of course, under lamplight in a cave next to the cave where Jesus was born. So there's, again, further 4th century tradition regarding the location of the Church of the Nativity that we'll also look at in this study. So Jesus' ministry in and around Jerusalem, and also certain traditions regarding the Last Supper we'll look at in these PowerPoints related to Jesus' ministry in Jerusalem.